Home, and today we're ready for part 2 on the responsibilities of husbands, and then next week will be part 1 on the responsibilities of wives, and we'll have some matters to say about parenting and then an assortment of other issues related to the home after that. We're going to have a quiz now over the last 2 weeks since I was away last week. By the way, I was in Amory, Mississippi for a gospel meeting last week. I don't know, have you been to Amory? Raise your hand if you've been to Amory. Amory. Not many people. Good. That's between Tupelo and Columbus. And it was, y'all know where it is. And I enjoyed that meeting very much. Never had preached there before. And that was a great congregation. And they were excited too because last Sunday was their first week to be meeting again for Bible class. They had been meeting for worship, but last week they met for their Bible classes for the first time. And so that was a special event. Okay, here we are on April 25th. We're going to be mainly in 1 Peter 3, but we have a number of other passages to consider. The first one we're going to look at is 1 Corinthians 7, beginning in verse 12. So you can turn over to 1 Corinthians 7 because we have one matter to finish up on concerning marriage and divorce that we want to cover. That was our topic 2 weeks ago, and there was a matter that we did not get to discuss due to time. So we're going to discuss that, and then we'll move back to the issue of husbands. But let's have our quiz. Multiple choice. According to Ephesians 5, a husband must love his wife as Adam loved Eve, as Joseph loved Mary, as Christ loves the church, or as Paul loved the Ephesians. Which one is it? C, that's right, as Christ loved the church. Multiple choice. Again, according to Ephesians 5, a husband must love his wife as he loves the Lord, as he loves his children, as he loves his own body, or as Paul loved the Ephesians. Again, it's C. Maybe I have a tendency toward making the answer C. Fill in the blank, Matthew 19:9. And I say unto you, whosoever shall put away his wife except it be for blank and shall marry another committeth adultery. What goes in the blank? Fornication. Good. And again, that is the best way I know of to render that word. Some translations will say sexual immorality, but as we use the phrase sexual immorality, it's a broader word. It's a broader idea than fornication. But what is meant in this passage is the act. So fornication itself would be the best way to translate it. And that's why when I quote the verse, I typically quote from the King James Version, because it has the word fornication, and that really is the idea Jesus had in mind. Multiple choice again. Which is false? If a person is baptized biblically, his past sins are washed away. Is that one true? Yes. B, a person must be repenting of his past sins when he is baptized. Is that true? Yes. C, if a person is baptized biblically, his adulterous marriage becomes innocent. Is that true? Now that would be false, because remember, he's living in his sin of fornication. And Colossians 3, 1-7 uses that phraseology that a person lives in sins. If he's a practitioner of a sin, such as fornication, wouldn't have to be a sexual sin, but you're living in that sin if you're a regular practitioner of it. And so a person's guilt, if he's in an adulterous marriage, is not simply getting into that marriage, but remaining in an adulterous relationship. So it's not as though a person can say, I was baptized, so my marriage has been cleansed. No, you've been cleansed of your past sins, but if you're perpetuating a sin by living in a relationship that God doesn't approve, then you're still in that sin, and you need to get out of it. Okay, number 6, a person can live in adultery. And that's true. We don't mean he may, as in God permits it. We mean it's possible for a person to live in a sin. Okay, so the answer is C. True or false? Adultery of the heart qualifies as the fornication mentioned in Matthew 19:9. True or false? That's false, right? We gave a number of reasons for proving that fornication, bodily fornication, is not the same as lust or looking on a woman to lust after her. Okay, here's the last of those 9 truths that we had 2 weeks ago from Matthew 19:9, and this is the one we didn't have a chance to discuss, and it is that Paul did not contradict Jesus in 1 Corinthians 7, 15 to 16. The reason I bring this up is because some people say that whereas Jesus only gave one legitimate reason for remarriage, Paul gave another. Jesus said, except it be for fornication, which is an exclusive clause. In other words, it allows only for that exception. He says, whoever puts away his wife and marries another commits adultery, except it be. And here is the exception, here the only one, except it be for fornication. So if somebody comes along and offers another reason for legitimizing remarriage beyond death, Romans 7, 1 to 2, but if he says you can be married to a lady, put her away, marry another, and it's not for fornication, I've got another reason. That violates Matthew 19:9. But some people say Paul did that Paul loosened the rules that Jesus gave, and it's in this context. So let's read it together, beginning in verse 12. But to the rest I say, not the Lord, that is, Jesus didn't utter these words, but this is still inspired apostolic writing, that if any brother has a wife who is an unbeliever, and she consents to live with him, he must not divorce her. Okay, so Paul's saying marriage holds even if you've obeyed the gospel, but your spouse didn't. That the fact that you're divided religiously doesn't dissolve your marriage. Then verse 13, and a woman who has an unbelieving husband, and he consents to live with her, she must not send her husband away. She can't say, well, I'm a Christian, and you're not, so we just need to not be married anymore. Verse 14, for the unbelieving husband is sanctified through his wife, and the unbelieving wife is sanctified through her believing husband, for otherwise your children are unclean, but now they are holy. The point there is, you're not having illegitimate children. Apparently that was the concern of some in Corinth. In other words, are our children legitimate, even though one of us is a Christian and one of us is not? And Paul says, certainly this union is right before God, even if one of the parties in the union is not right before God as an individual. The union still can produce legitimate offspring. Okay, verse 15, yet if the unbelieving one leaves, let him leave. The brother or sister is not under bondage in such cases, but God has called us to peace. For how do you know, O wife, whether you will save your husband? Or how do you know, O husband, whether you will save your wife? The key phrase is, for our purposes, not under bondage. And some people say the phrase not under bondage means that if your spouse deserts you, goes somewhere else, not committing fornication, but if your spouse leaves you, then you're not under the marriage bond anymore, and so you can marry whoever you want to. So that offers an additional exception to the MDR rule that Jesus gave in Matthew 19:9. But that is not the case. That's a wrong reading of the passage. For one thing, it implies that Paul contradicted Jesus, and that can't be true, because Paul was speaking as an apostle and speaking with God's authority in this epistle. But beyond that, the context shows that that's not what Paul meant. Because verse 16 says, read it again, for how do you know, O wife, whether you will save your husband? Or how do you know, O husband, whether you will save your wife? Whatever action Paul is sanctioning in verse 15, it is the kind of an action that would result potentially in the wife saving the husband, or the husband saving the wife. So what would that be? And how would that husband or wife not be under bondage? The idea is that if a Christian spouse has an unbelieving spouse, and that spouse leaves, that the Christian is not under bondage to leave Christ in order to stay with that husband. So let me explain how this might happen. You've got a non-believing spouse, wife or husband, who says, if you don't stop this Christianity business, I am leaving you. You're always going to church. You're always reading your Bible. You're always investing yourself in spiritual things that I don't even believe in. And you got to pick between me or Christ. I don't believe in Christ. I don't think he's divine. I think he was confused. And I think you're confused for following him. Maybe this person was saying in Corinth, He might have been saying, I believe in the Roman gods. That would have been typical of people living there. He might say, I like to go down to the idol temple and offer sacrifices to the idols. And Paul talks about their temptation to offer sacrifices to idols in this very book. So do you suppose there were some Christians whose spouses went down to the idol temple? And what if you're a prominent Corinthian citizen who offers sacrifices to the idols, and it becomes known that you're married to a lady who's a Christian, who refuses to eat sacrifices to idols in the temple? Then what are you going to do? You're liable to say, if you want to be my spouse in Corinth, which was, by the way, do a little study of Corinth. This is one of the most immoral cities ever in the history of mankind. We think America is getting bad. I don't think we have anything on Corinth, at least not in most of our cities. So here's a husband who says to his wife, let's say, you can be my spouse, but only if you renounce Christianity. And Paul says to that poor lady, you are not under bondage. In other words, your first commitment is to Christ. If she lovingly and respectfully says to her husband, I'm sticking with Christ, that's my first commitment. Now, I would like to be your spouse too, because I've made a commitment to you. I love you as my husband, and I want to honor you. I've just got to honor Christ first. So if you will let me continue my Christianity, I am content to live with you and to serve you as your spouse. I just can't renounce my Christianity. So it's Jesus first, but then you're second. And I will do everything I can to help you and to have a good home for you and to love and train up our children in a good way. It's just that Jesus comes first. And then if she lives that way, what kind of an effect do you suppose that would have on the husband? It might have a seasoning effect, so that before long he says, you know, there's something to this Christianity. I see what a difference Christ has made in our home, and I'm content with it. I may even consider it for myself. The Christian remaining faithful may cause the non-believing spouse to be saved. But what about leaving your spouse? What if the husband says to his wife, you got to pick between Christ and me, and the Christian spouse says, well, I'm out of here then. Our marriage is over. Is that going to have the same leavening effect on the husband? Obviously, what Paul is talking about is a Christian respectfully and lovingly maintaining his or her priorities in such a way that it could have a good impact. Not saying, our marriage is dissolved and I'm going to marry somebody else because now you're threatening to desert me. You have left. Now I can marry somebody else. That would not have the effect that Paul says this action, whatever it is, that this not under bondage thing has to do with. It's got to be something that could potentially lead to the conversion of the non-Christian spouse. Okay? Any questions or comments along those lines before we move on to the husbands? I wanted to get that out there because it's such a prevalent doctrine. Yes, sir.
But he still, even though he said it in a part, he doesn't say anything about remarriage. You know, when
that's right.
You know, so know, there may be situations that a wife or husband may depart, but they're just not able to remarry.
Yes. Well, he certainly addresses that earlier in the chapter, the possibility that there may need to be a separation for a time. But it's not for remarriage. It's for prayer and fasting. So read the entire chapter of 1 Corinthians 7, and Paul does address that possibility. The reason some people would say this part of the chapter allows for remarriage is the not under bondage phrase. But again, it's begging the question. Just because Paul says you're not under bondage, what kind of bondage are we talking about? Which commitment is under consideration? The context has to determine that. If I say to you, you're not obligated, then your next question is going to be, well, Caleb, what am I not obligated to? What do you mean? Same thing in 1 Corinthians 7. Just taking that one phrase and saying a wife is not obligated, we have to then say, well, not obligated to what? And Paul's context determines, he's saying you're not obligated to give up Christ to be with your spouse. You see? Okay. Remember Acts 5:29 along these lines? This is where Peter said, we must obey whom? We must obey God rather than men. That would go for the marital relationship. If my spouse is asking me to do something against God, I've got to obey God rather than my spouse. Isn't that the case? Okay, now let's go to the husband, and I want to start with this principle that two people can be equal in their personhood and in their importance, or we might say their intrinsic value as people made in the image of God, and yet have distinct roles. That's true in the Godhead, that there is equality amongst the three persons that are the one God, and yet there is a distinction of roles for purposes of redeeming man. And this is never clearer than in 1 Corinthians 11:3, where Paul says that the head of Christ is God. Does that mean somehow that God the Father is more intrinsically valuable than God the Son? No, it just means that Jesus, during his state of humiliation, submitted himself to the will of the Father. And that's in Philippians 2:5-8 and other passages. Jesus humbled himself. And so he was submissive to the authority that the Father and the Son shared. That is the relationship they shared of equality in heaven before the foundation of the world. You know, Jesus, according to Isaiah 9:6, is the everlasting Father. And he is equal to Jehovah, Isaiah 40 and verse 3. And he is the one who is the express image and the likeness of God. So we're talking about somebody who is in the position of God and yet submits in the scheme of redemption to do God's will on earth to save mankind. Equality in value, equality in power, and yet they distinguish themselves for a particular purpose. So all Christians, while equal in personhood and importance, have varying roles based on our abilities and opportunities. The Bible teaches over and over again that Christians have different talents. Christians have different opportunities. We're living in different places in the world. And so we have different obligations, even though we are all of equal worth before God. There are people who have the obligation to preach the gospel this morning in India, but I don't have that obligation because I'm not in India. But if I were and I were preaching, could I preach anything other than the oracles of God? No, it's a difference in opportunity. And there are some who don't have the opportunity to, just go on down the line. Some have different talents, different abilities. I'm not the one who's in the position to be the treasurer of the church because I don't know very much about finances, and so that's just not my field. But there are other people who have that, and so on down the line. Each of us has different talents, even though we're of equal value before God. That's true in the church, but it's also true in marriage that we're equal in importance, but we differ in God-assigned roles. And this is back to Genesis 2:18, where the woman is created as the helper for the man. This doesn't mean that the woman's inferior to the man, but God has given her a different role. And woman is created as the helper, and in 1 Corinthians 11 and verse 9, we find that the head of the woman is the man. And this is just a difference in role. And we're going to talk about the great contributions that the husband makes and the wife makes to marriage. And we're also going to acknowledge that there is a complementarity of roles. That is, husband and wife complement one another. The opposite of that view would be what we would call egalitarianism, which is the view that there is no difference between the roles of men and women, that you're being sexist if you say that there is any difference in the role, that man has a role that God has assigned him that's anything different from the role that God assigned women or the wife. And that's just not true. God has assigned different roles. Even though man and wife make great contributions, they're equal before God in their intrinsic worth. So we take the position called, in modern times is called complementarianism, which is that the husband complements the wife and the wife complements the husband by fulfilling the God-assigned roles that each of them has. Here are some verses that show that the difference in role is not merely a product of sin. There are some people who say, okay, we'll admit that husbands and wives have different roles, but that's just because of sin. And when we become Christians, then all those roles that were a part of the sinful punishment or the punishment for sin in Genesis 3, those roles go away. So that means husband and wife are totally equal in every way with no difference in roles because they're in Christ. And in Christ, there's neither male nor female. That's what they'll misuse Galatians 3:26 and 27. Neither male nor female. That is, husband is exactly the same as wife, no difference in roles. because all that was just sin's punishment. Wait a minute. In the Bible, there are differences in roles prior to sin. So here are 7 different Bible principles that show there was a difference in role even before woman sinned and man sinned. Adam was created first, and then Eve. And Paul makes it clear that that carries importance even in the Christian age in 1 Timothy 2:13. Eve was created as Adam's helper, not the other way around. Now that was before sin, wasn't it? Eve was created as Adam's helper before sin. Adam named Eve, even as he named the other animals. This is the idea that Adam had a degree of authority because he was in the naming position. God named the human race man and not woman, or a gender-neutral term. He said, I will call them man. God spoke to Adam first after the fall. Even though Eve was the first one to sin, God still treated Adam as the representative of their household. Then Adam, not Eve, is the representative of the whole human race. In 1 Corinthians 15, when God talks about humankind sinning, he doesn't talk about Eve. He talks about Adam, because there is a position of headship associated with the husband. Again, not denigrating the wife, not saying the wife doesn't have an indispensable role to play or that she is not intrinsically just as valuable as the man, just saying it's always been this way in Scripture, that there was an assumed role of headship and authority associated with the husband. Then the curse in Genesis 3:16-19, the curse, the punishment for sin, brought about a distortion of roles, but not new roles. That is, things were going to get a lot harder for mankind, but it did not introduce fundamentally new roles for husband and wife or erase the roles that husband and wife already had. The woman is going to have a desire for her husband, but he will rule over you. That's what Genesis 3:16 says. There's some discussion about what the desire refers to. That was her punishment for sin. The man's punishment was the tilling of the soil would be a lot more difficult for him. By the sweat of his brow, he would have to do that. But for the woman, her punishment was the desire for your husband, and he will rule over you. Well, the word rule is a word. I know we're going quickly, but we have a lot of material. So the word rule has to do with military. Its usage is domineering. It has a pretty negative connotation, that it is as though there will be some conflict in the relationship between husband and wife that had not been there before. So it may be that this refers to the woman wanting to usurp authority from the man, and that he would nevertheless rule over her. So that desire would go unfulfilled because she's going to want to take charge. That would be part of the punishment for sin, but this man would still rule. Or it may be that she still desires to have a marriage with a man even though now he's a sinful man. And so the home is not going to be as harmonious as it would have been otherwise. Either way, and I couldn't prove to you one way or another what the desire on the part of the woman in Genesis 3:16 refers to, but it's a negative thing. And it's going to hurt marriage. It's going to hurt the home. Either way. If God says, here's woman's role, and she says, I want a different role, that's a problem. Or if she says, I really want to be married to this man, but he's no longer the kind of man that he was prior to the fall, then that's a problem too. So sin marred the picture. And even though we can't be definitive about what the desire is, still it was a significant punishment for the woman. And also the other part of the punishment, which we haven't gotten yet, is the pain in childbearing. And we don't have to explain what that means. If we've had children or our spouse has had children, then we know something either by experience or by observation of what that pain involves. Not just at the time that you have children, but throughout your adult life. That's a very difficult punishment that God put on the woman. Okay, now, having said that there are these different roles, we're about to talk about the husband's roles. This, remember, presupposes that you can have different roles. And I keep saying that because it's unpopular today. For me to stand up in front of an audience, especially an audience that has men and women, and say, God gives women a role and God gives men a role, that is considered intolerant and sexist and bigoted and unchristian by many people, but it's just biblical. And our homes will be happy when each person in the home, husband, wife, child, plays the role that God intended them to play. And so first we're going to talk about the 4 basic responsibilities of the husband. And you could parse these out differently. If you were listing them, you might come up with 10 or something. You might come up with 2. But I'm going to say there are 4. And I think it's a helpful way to think of it, to divide it up in this way. And then next time we'll begin to talk about the wife's responsibilities. The first one is the one that Darren considered last week, and that is the husband's responsibility to love his wife as Christ loved the church. That is, with a self-sacrificial love that places the needs of the wife above his own needs. So today we're going to talk about the remaining 3. The first is that he needs to provide for and protect his family. 1 Timothy 5:8 says that if a man does not provide for those of his own household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. So that'll be the second one. The third is to lead his wife and family spiritually. That is, to push them toward heaven, to help them understand what they need to know and to do what they need to do in order to be saved. Then finally, to dwell with his wife and family in an understanding way. We'll talk about what that would involve. And of course, you all have insights into all these areas that are greater than I do, because many of you have more experience than I do, so I will solicit your input on how these practically play out in the home as we go along. But let's go to the first one that we're going to discuss today, and that is the husband's obligation to protect and provide. The Bible, from beginning to end, puts the husband in the position of the provider and protector of the family, whether we're talking about the Old Testament or the New Testament. It's either assigned that he will do this, or it's simply presupposed that he will do this. And I've given you a bunch of passages up here, Old Testament and New Testament, that demonstrate this. When the Israelites went out to battle, they didn't send their women out to battle, did they? They always sent the men. And it's the men, the masculine gender, who are assigned to provide for their families in 1 Timothy 5:8. And if they love their wives as they love their own bodies, and nourish their wives and cherish their wives, and God gives that responsibility to the husband, then that would indicate God expects the husband to be in the position of the nourisher. It doesn't mean that the wife has nothing to do with the family or the husband being nourished, but the husband is the one who is making sure that that provision is available. And so that's throughout the Scriptures. And 1 Peter 3:17, I just noticed this, should say 1 through 7. I'm sorry about that. But then the other reason I say the husband has the primary obligation is because there is a complete absence of passages that teach that the wife is supposed to do this. Again, not that she can't contribute to it. For example, the virtuous woman in Proverbs 31 contributes mightily to the welfare of her household. And every husband in here who has a good wife knows that our wives contribute so much to our household being taken care of. But whose ultimate responsibility is it to make sure that the household is provided for and protected? That responsibility rests with the husband. And I suppose there are many of us who could do a better job, especially when we talk about the spiritual provision and the emotional provision and the caretaking provision. There are many ways in which we could provide better. But for now, we're just observing. This is our responsibility. And Titus 2:3-5, remember, puts the wife in the position of being keeper of the home. So the basic picture is, and we'll talk more about that phrase, keeper at home, oikuros, next week or maybe the week after when we talk about the responsibilities of the wife. But that means she is, that word literally means a domestic. And that doesn't mean that if she ever goes outside of the house, she's sinning, or if she ever makes any money outside of the house, that it's a sin. But it does mean that she sees her primary obligation as taking care of things around the house. That's what keeper at home means. And so the husband, according to this biblical picture, makes sure that she has everything she needs to do that, assists her, follows the golden rule in helping all that work out, But there are these two different roles. They help each other in doing everything they do. Husband and wife are team. They're a team. But they do have the different roles, where the husband provides, the woman takes care of the things around the house. Okay, let's go to the next one, and we'll get all of these responsibilities on the table, and then we can open it up for comments or questions. Number 2, husband, or actually this is the third on our list, because Darren talked about one last week. Remember, Darren talked about the responsibility to love our spouses as Christ loved the church and as we love our own bodies. Second one is to provide and protect. This is the third one, his responsibility to lead his wife and family toward heaven. Obviously, Christ does that, and that came out in our passage last week, that Christ leads the church to heaven. And remember, the husband relates to the spouse and the family as Christ does to the church. He's the head, and as the head, he does not merely dictate, he leads. And he leads in a servant way. Remember how Christ led the church in a servant way by laying down his life for it? So the husband leads, but not in a merely authoritarian way. He has authority, but he leads in a servant way, where he says, here are our expectations. But these are expectations that are based not on my own domineering spirit, but expectations that are based on the principles in God's Word, and I'm going to help you meet the expectations. I'm not going to say to my family, here are the list of things that I expect everybody to do. Now you go do them. No, he loves enough to assist. He loves to help. He says, here's what I expect because I'm helping us get to heaven. I'm not just expecting this because I like to stroke my own ego. I'm expecting this out of our family members because we need to develop into the right kind of people, the people God approves, the people God is pleased to call his own, the people who are pleasing to Christ, and so forth. So here's what we want to do, and we want to do it in God's way. Because the husband carries this headship in the home, he must ensure the spirituality of the home. Remember in Ephesians 6:4, does it say, mothers, provoke not your children to wrath? No, it says, fathers, provoke not your children to wrath, but bring them up in the discipline and in the instruction of the Lord. So even though mothers do a whole lot, in fact, in terms of hours, probably a lot more than fathers typically do, because remember, fathers are out working a good bit of the time. But mothers will do so much to rear the children in the discipline and in the instruction of the Lord. But who's ultimately responsible for making sure that gets done? It's dad. So the buck stops with dad, making sure that our children are brought up in the right way. What if a husband takes the attitude, well, I'm going to see to it that it gets done, and all I'm going to do in that regard is just give my wife orders? Is that going to be effective in bringing our children to the Lord? Or is it going to be the husband who says, I'm going to encourage my wife in doing this, and she's going to do much of the teaching of the children while I'm away, but I'm also going to ensure that I'm involved, and I'm spending time myself, because I can't merely pass the buck to my wife and say, I'm distancing myself from this effort. I'm going to withdraw once I've assigned it to you. That would be so careless and detrimental to the children, and would provoke them to wrath, I would suggest, because here we've got a wife who's trying to bring up her children in the right way, and the husband is disconnected from it. Wouldn't that be detrimental? Because the children would say, which parent am I supposed to follow? And that would be great trouble. So the husband needs to be a helper, a servant, participating in that effort with his wife. And then notice, if the husband's the leader, always leadership in the Bible presupposes willingness to serve on the part of the leader. Not just with Jesus, but if we're talking about Moses or Joshua or any of the kings, whatever the case, the judges, leadership presupposes the leader's willingness to serve. And this is Romans 2:21 and 22, where Paul said, you preach that someone should not steal. Do you steal? Or you who abhor idolatry, do you rob temples? Or you say you should not commit adultery. Do you commit adultery? Well, what about a leader who says, wife, you're going to do this, but he's not willing to do it himself? There's no circumstance under which he would stoop to doing what he would order other people to do. What about an eldership where people say, this has happened not at Lakeside, but in other places, where the elders say, attend the gospel meeting, and then they don't show up. Or they say, we got a new work program. We want everybody to be involved in this congregational work program, and the elders don't show up. Or the preacher preaches that we ought to participate in this area or that, and then he doesn't participate. So it sends the wrong message. Or the parent who says, don't be using substances that hurt your body while they're smoking or drinking. You see, what about the husband who says to his wife, you better be doing such and such, but he's too high and mighty to participate in that himself? You see how that would be hypocritical. Okay, so this is the second responsibility we wanted to discuss today. The third overall, his responsibility to lead his wife and family. And we could give so many examples of areas in life where the husband does that. Too many times the wife is the spiritual leader in the home. And the husband says, well, Christianity is mainly for women and children, and I'll tag along maybe if they want me to. That is totally unbiblical. That's just wrong. The strongest spiritual person in the house ought always to be the father. Not saying anybody has little responsibility before God, but he's the leader. He should be the strongest. And the other people in the household, whether we're talking about wife or children, ought to be able to look to him. So let's just ask ourselves, and this won't be universally applicable because there are some guys who obey the gospel late in life. But they should still be spiritually strong and say, to the best of my knowledge, I may not know as much as my wife does. She may have been a Christian for 40 years, and I don't know as much as she does, but I'm committed. And I'm going to strive to be the most committed person in my house. So my wife may be able to quote more Bible verses, but I'm going to be leading the way to obedience, no matter what. So let's just ask ourselves, in our practice at home, in terms of Bible knowledge, are we giving as much diligence as our spouse is? Husbands, are we giving all diligence so that our wife could say, even if she presently knows more about the Bible than we do, could she say, my husband is trying at least as hard as I am to know the Bible? That's a real question. Or could we say, my spouse would, if she's being honest, my wife will say, my husband is at least as committed to sexual purity as I am. I can tell by what he watches. I can tell by the language he uses. I can tell by the way he treats the opposite gender. He's at least as committed to sexual purity as I am. Now again, the spouse isn't the standard. Christ is the standard. But we're asking about leadership and whether our behavior would demonstrate our commitment to lead our families. And go on down. My husband is at least as committed to attending every assembly of the church as I am. Okay, next one. His responsibility, and this is the last one, and then we'll have time for comments. He has a responsibility to dwell with the wife in an understanding way. I had you turn over, or at least I mentioned, 1 Peter 3. And let's turn over to that passage and see this responsibility. 1 Peter 3. And remember, the first 6 verses deal with a Christian woman whose husband is not a Christian and her outlook for trying to convert him. And, of course, the principle is if you can't win him with the word, then you win him without the word. If you can, you try. And that means being faithful. And that entails a number of things that are particular challenges in that case, and Peter goes over those. And then in verse 7, he switches to the husbands. And he says, you husbands, in the same way, live with your wives in an understanding way. I believe King James Version says, according to knowledge, and that would be fine too. Does anybody else have another translation you like of understanding? It comes from the Greek word gnosis, which means knowledge. So I kind of like according to knowledge there, but understanding is fine. Does anybody else have a translation of that you would like to bring up? How is the husband to live with his wife? What does your Bible say? Verse 7. Oh dear, we have less time than I thought. Okay, anybody? Okay, well, understanding way. Dwell with her in an understanding way, as with someone weaker, since she is a woman. Okay, we'll talk about that in a minute, but something associated with being a woman makes her, in some sense, weaker. So we'll talk about what that means in a moment. And show her honor as a fellow heir of the grace of life. She's an heiress of God. How would you treat somebody who's an heiress of a king? Suppose you marry an heiress of some country somewhere, and she's going to inherit a fabulous fortune. You might say, well, I treat that woman pretty well. Okay, you're married to an heiress if you're married to a Christian, and she's an heiress of something much greater than an earthly fortune. She's someone who's going to inherit heaven, according to 1 Peter 1:1-4. Okay, live with her as a fellow heir of the grace of life so that your prayers will not be hindered. Whether God hears my prayers is contingent on how I treat my wife. And that's a sobering thought, isn't it? Do you suppose you've ever prayed and God didn't hear you because you had just been ugly to your wife? I'm sure that's happened to me. But let's look. The husband must understand his wife's unique qualities. Can we say that about dwelling with your spouse according to knowledge? I could know something about women generally without knowing my wife. The word that's translated understanding would involve knowing what is unique about the spouse. That is, she has idiosyncrasies. I don't mean that in a negative way. I just mean she has unique qualities. Remember, Christ loves his church as his bride, and his bride has unique qualities. That's how Christ can tell his church from all other religious bodies. When Christ comes back to get his church, he's going to take the right wife. He's going to take the one that's really his bride. Well, I don't want to denigrate Christ. He can tell people apart whatever. He knows everything. But the church does have unique qualities that distinguish it from all the other bodies. My wife has qualities that attract me to her, that I picked her out because she had them, and I don't get her mixed up with any other woman. And so here, know about those unique qualities, not just on a surface level, but what about what makes my spouse happy and what makes her sad? That's not the same for every woman. We shouldn't think in such a cookie-cutter way. What are some things that I do that might annoy her? And would it be possible for me to modify that? Not trying to change who I fundamentally am, not being unchristian, but here's something that doesn't make that much difference to me. It annoys her to death. So wouldn't it be kind to her to try to modify that? Or here's some habit I have. It's annoying to her. Could I change it? Could I be more considerate in the way I speak to her? Just thinking out loud. If I'm following the golden rule with my spouse, then I'm trying to understand how she thinks and how I could interact with her in a way that would make our relationship better. Then, notice it's not just trying to know about her, but it's honoring her, not being harsh toward her. Colossians 3:18-19 says that the husband must not be bitter toward his wife as he shows honor to her, not being harsh. And this relates to this idea of her being weaker. It may be tempting for the husband to fail to show honor because of this weakness. He may get impatient with her. There may be some times where he's annoyed with her because of whatever the weakness is. So let's talk about the weakness for a moment in the moments we have left. This is a Greek adjective, asthenes, I should say, and it refers to some limitation on the part of the wife, some weakness. But the context does not specify what it is. It's something that has to do with just being a woman, not being this particular person, but with being a woman. Remember, she's the weaker vessel since she is a woman. So what is that? May just be, and I believe the whole picture is physical, because, as we know, women typically have less brute strength than men. The Journal of Applied Physiology says women have an average of 26 pounds less skeletal muscle mass than men. They have 40% less upper body strength than men and 33% less lower body strength. Now, you may be thinking, actually, that's not the case in our house. You know, you may think my wife could take me if she needed to. Well, that's not, this is on average. You know, this is in general. So, let me finish up. I'm almost done. So, the wife is typically less strong physically than the man. But also, remember the curse. We mentioned Genesis 3:16, where the wife has been cursed with all of the difficulties associated with childbearing. That's part of her physical makeup too, and that entails some weaknesses, some things that men don't have. But of course, being able to bear children is an indispensable strength, isn't it? And I can tell you from my observation that my spouse has more strength, and you would say this too if you've seen your wife bear children. That is more strength than most men could imagine having. So there's some kind of almost superhumanity that comes over women in having children. But there's a lot of weakness that's entailed in that. And then we might also suggest that women are more sensitive emotionally. And emotional sensitivity, again, is a strength. And sometimes I wish I had more of it. But it may be that man's emotional makeup, that is the masculine emotional makeup, is better suited for handling confrontation. Remember, God gave men the role of being the ones who are the protectors of the family. Do you suppose God put in man an emotional makeup that may, at least generally speaking, be more conducive toward that confrontation? And I would just remind you of Titus chapter 1, 9 through 11, where the elders, who are always men, are assigned with being the ones who confront false doctrine in the church. That doesn't mean a woman can't confront false doctrine. But I might just suggest that may be part of what's mentioned here. Again, the emotional tenderness is a strength. Every elder must be married to a woman who can help him understand that. But also there's a confrontational nature that might apply in the masculine gender in a different way. Okay, anybody want to have a last word? I meant to have more time for comments, but we just have to move so quickly through this material. Anybody want to have a last word? Okay, thank you very much.